Good. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you. You make me think when I said Winnipeg. I was raised in Minneapolis, and I don't know why, but one summer my family drove up to Winnipeg, and
That's where you go if you're a bad person.
It was in the heat of summer. It was 106 degrees, and we were driving up the Red River, which I think is the border between North Dakota and Minnesota. Oh, 1807. Dave, thanks. Yeah. But I just remember this blistering heat because it was long ago enough that we didn't have air conditioning in the car. I remember that. It's just miserable. So it's probably like 1958 or something like that.
Sounds like 1887 as well.
I don't know what we were doing. But my father had this Buick, I think it was called a Roadster.
Oh, yeah, the Roadster.
They had 3 Buicks. They had like the Special, the Roadster, and something else. I can't remember. They're all the same basic car, but each one with more jazz and special things. I have no idea why we were going to Winnipeg, Manitoba, But I do remember being up there for some reason and stopping. And there was a dead turtle on the side of the river that was just enormous. It was like a snapping turtle. And it was so huge. And I remember thinking to myself, how can you have such a huge turtle living so far north? I don't know why I was thinking that was a rational thought, but nonetheless, that's my images of Winnipeg.
Why is the temperature so hot there in the summer?
Well, it's in the middle of the continent. Yeah. So it's not necessarily especially hot there, but, well, I don't know. The Dakotas are hot. There's no moderating influence and no body of water or ocean or anything like that. And the whole Mississippi River Valley is very, very humid. I have friends who grew up in St. Louis, and they said it's just horrible. And before air conditioning, mosquitoes and humidity, really tough. Well, all right. So anyway, sorry to be a little bit late today, coming from night court and some other errands. I think we're at chapter 2. Does anyone know anything differently than that? Starting in chapter 2, I think we got through chapter 1 the first time. And again, this book, The Buddha, a very short introduction by Michael Carrithers. I read it a long time ago. And I think what's very helpful for us because, again, the Tibetans, because they come from a Buddhist culture, a lot of this is, all the stories are there, of course. But you don't necessarily sit down and as a child and learn the stories. Rather, they just have contact with these wonderful teachers or monks or somebody in the family is a monk, and you've got a temple at the head of your valley. And there's, all the traditions that go back, who was married to whom, and the history of the various monastery itself. And, they're immersed in this. But for us, I found it very helpful for knowing the story of the Buddha and some of the actual incidents in that. Because for one thing, again, the vow of bodhicitta, I've always really encouraged wide reading by practitioners because we're communicating, with our fellow citizens and beings that we share this space with. And so it's very helpful, it's very helpful to have your knowledge as wide as possible. It puts things in context, but also helps you communicate. Because certainly a lot of the terms, and people don't even know what Sanskrit language is. At least I didn't. Let alone Tibetan and how they're related, and Japan and China. It gets very confusing very fast because there's just limited knowledge and to be expected. So this book, I think, by this British scholar, I found helpful a long time ago. So let's hope that it's still working for us. So chapter 2 is early life and renunciation. Later traditions embroidered a great deal on the Buddha's early life and appearance, but of this we can rely on little. The conventional images of him are perhaps true to his characteristic posture and meditation, but since such images were not made until centuries after his death, they cannot be portraits. There are some grounds for believing that he was handsome according to the tastes of his time. For a relatively early source, the Agana Sutta praises his beauty at the expense of the neighboring king Pasenadi. As for his character, apart from his philosophy, little can be said, for in our sources his character is his philosophy. We might justifiably assume, however, that he was passionately intense and rebellious in his youth, for no placid and obedient character could have set out to do what he did, still less achieve it. Yeah. We are on firmer ground with two facts. First, the Buddha was born among the Sakya people, probably at their capital, Kapilavastu. He's using the Pali pronunciations, like Kapilavastu. Pali's a little softer in its sounds than Sanskrit, which tends to be harder. So Kapilavastu is Sanskrit, Kapilavatu is Pali, and I naturally kind of slip into Sanskrit again and again just because it's been exposed to more of it. But probably born at their capital, now the town of Lumbini in the lowland Terai region of Nepal. Second, his family or clan name was Gautama, Sanskrit Gautama. He was not called Buddha awakened until after his awakening, but for convenience I will use the title throughout. These facts reveal nothing about his childhood or education, but they do place him in the wider Gangetic civilization of which he was a part, and they suggest something of the circumstances which he inherited. The Shakyas were one of a number of peoples spread along the northern edge of the Ganges Basin, at the periphery of then developing North Indian civilization. When the Buddha was born, these peoples were still more or less independent and had roughly similar systems of government. They were ruled by oligarchies or councils of elders or some mixture of the two, and might therefore best be called tribal republics. Some of these might have elected a leader for a fixed term, but they did not have kings in the strict sense, and therefore the later tradition that the Buddha was a king's son must be dismissed. However, the Sakyas considered themselves to have the effective rank of kings, nobles, and warriors in respect of the wider civilization, and indeed, they probably did not recognize, as others did, the ceremonial precedence of the Brahmins, priests of high rank. They considered themselves an elite, and it is difficult to resist the impression that the Buddha had the confidence of high birth in his dealings with the wider world. There is evidence that the Sakyas struggled to remain aloof from that world, but they were already deeply embroiled in it. The Buddha's clan name, Gautama, was itself used elsewhere, and probably originally by Brahmins. Indeed, the very scale against which the Shakyas claimed their high status really only made sense beyond their borders. Moreover, they were already in effect tributaries to a king in the south and were probably tied economically to southern commerce. The Sakyans and the tribal republic as a whole were more acted upon than acting. They were to contribute to Indian civilization only their great kinsman, the Buddha, and certain of their values preserved in his teaching. The centers of change and of power lay in the central Ganges basin. A collection of small, heroic warrior societies had spread along the river centuries earlier, and these societies developed into centralized monarchical states. There was a traditional list of 16 of these great countries, quote unquote, but already in the Buddha's youth, some had swallowed others and were on the way to further conquests. One, Kosala, conquered the Sakyas in the Buddha's lifetime. Another, Magadha, already ruler of Western Bengal and destined to be the nucleus of the Mauryan Empire, was to engulf the Vajji confederacy of tribal republics after his death. The future lay with the kings and not with the republics. At the heart of these states appeared true urban centers where there had been none before. These swelling cities contained the king's courts, and to the courts and cities were drawn the makings of an urban life, merchants, craftsmen of new skills, soldiers and laborers, conquered lords to render tribute, the displaced, the foreigners, the opportunists. There was a more complex division of labor and of status between people, and those of different languages and cultures were now thrown together to get along as best they could. The court and the city also drew the countryside into relation with this urban life through force wielded by the king's soldiers and officials, through the subtler effect of long-distance commerce, and through movements of population. The archaeological record shows no planning in these ancient Indian cities. They were chaotic, and that chaos perhaps best symbolizes both the difficulties and the creative possibilities of these newly complex societies. Above all, the question was, how were the Indians to understand themselves among these unprecedented forms of common life? So it's interesting, I think, when I think about this, because again, the little that we know about it, it wasn't this situation of just like, sort of hard-baked tradition and tremendous stability. And these were rapidly changing societies. The Ganges basically flows east to west, more or less, west to east rather, in northern India. It comes down from the Himalayas and kind of makes a U-turn somewhere and then just shoots across northern India. The four estates. They began with one very old intellectual tool, a conception of the different estates in society. This was the property of the old heroic warrior societies and is reminiscent of the medieval European division of society into those who pray, those who fight, and those who labor, church, nobility, and peasants. In the Indian case, there were four estates. In Sanskrit, this is Varna. At the top were the Brahmins, priests of the sacrificial religion and intellectuals. Despite their rank, however, they did not wield power. That was left to the second estates, the warriors, in Sanskrit, Kshatriya, whose duty it was to fight, to rule, and to pay for sacrifices. This is the rank claimed by the Sakyas, and into this category fell kings and nobility. The third estate were the commoners, the producers, husbandmen, and the fourth estate were the servants. Those ineligible for the benefits of sacrificial religion and compelled to a life of servitude under the other three orders. This conception prescribed an orderly and hierarchical relationship between the states, each having certain claims on the others and certain obligations towards them, and each owing respect to the ones above. It also more or less described society, for these were communities of rank in which a warrior elite with their priests ruled over commoners and the still lower populace of the conquered. But, most important, this conception of estates was a deeply held and pervasive way of looking at the human world. It was not merely an ideology of different occupations or social ranks, for it also purported to describe the essential characteristics of the people in each estate. To call someone a warrior, for example, was not just to designate him as a bearer of arms and a ruler, but to also say that he was rich, powerful, generous, heroic, and of noble birth. A Brahmin was not just a priest by function, but also inherently endowed with wisdom, virtue, learning, personal purity, and purity of birth. And to call someone a servant was not merely to refer to his job, but also to his poverty, weakness, vileness, and low birth. Everything significant that was to be known about a person was known through his estate, whether for religious, psychological, political, economic, or social purpose. A person's appearance, psychic and physical endowments, his very essence was determined by his estate. It was as if the estates were different species. In this conception, there were no human beings, only Brahmins, warriors, husbandmen, and servants. Rather, as in the theory of apartheid, there are only blacks, whites, and coloreds. In the text of the old warrior societies, the Brahmanas, the order of estates is wholly taken for granted. It arose from the experience of the pre-urban Gangetic Indians and expressed the nature of their society. It was, if it was unfair from our point of view, that unfairness was already built into their world in many ways. So this book, when they're referring to apartheid, what's the publication date of it? Looking 1983. And it's also been said in other places that, the history of India, where did these divisions come from? Best they know, there was, a group of people that came down from the north and conquered northern India. Aryans, they call them the Aryans, yeah. They very well might be the people that conquered Iran, for instance, is that same word. Arya is Iran. So they were a central, from northern, I don't know exactly where in Asia, but they came down conquering people and then probably set themselves up, of course, as the rulers. And where the priests came from, I don't know. Yeah.
It seems like, just like Julius Caesar would say, because it's just like it seems like if your enemies outnumber you, you would create a class system like that and then have them war against each other and divide and conquer. It seems like that system is designed as a class system to control the farmer who wants to control people would do something like that to keep them all in a hierarchy. I mean, look at what they did to people in England with got put under wig in 5 hours just to get ready to go to a ball.
Yeah, I don't know.
I just wondering, I'd love to hear your opinion about that.
A little discussion on this, but what's interesting to me about India is what he's saying here, is that somehow, rather than there being this kind of fight going on between, they all somehow got into it, or they had an unbelievable, like he said here, it's very interesting. Where did we go?
Seems like there was no way out.
Well, yeah, definitely. And that unfairness was already built into their world in many ways. So I think that's the key thing. Although unfair from our point of view, that unfairness was already built into their world in many ways. I think this is something that's interesting that we don't sense. The different cultural assumptions, you might say. I find it sometimes in the humor. You heard me say just recently about, in our soak offerings, because Lama Tarchin always had jokes being told during the time when everyone's sharing the food and the drink. And especially in the old days in the tent, we'd have a lot of Tibetans and people there. And so people would be telling jokes at that point in the soak offering. And, you'd have the Tibetan. I remember Tachi Jamyang, this brilliant translator, Canadian, and his wife, Genyan Jamyang. Genyan comes from an old aristocratic family in Lhasa. And she's quite accomplished herself. But anyway, she got up and told a joke. And all the Tibetans just holding their sides, laughing at this joke. And all of us, the Ingis, just perplexed, what's the humor there? And then some of our folks got up and told a joke, and the same thing. All the Americans, North Americans laughing. And the Tibetans are just stone-faced, that's not funny. What's funny? So there are these, cultural assumptions. Yeah.
Anyway, we do have a similar system.
European, British Empire class system, which became the kindergarten, the modern school system that came out of Germany is based on that. If you put people into their classes, they're educated to the maximum, where they're going to end up in class. I mean, it's the same thing. It might be under different.
Well, perhaps. I think there are certainly similarities, but I think it's actually different. I think it's different because of to this day in India, the caste system is there in a very strong way.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that you have this kind of, probably the ones who, learned English, we learned that I think there are 300 million people who speak English in India. Because when they declared independence in, was it 47? They have 13 national languages. And so,
Some dialects.
and further divisions. But so English, even though it was the colonialists, English was what was the language that sort of united the governing class. So, they have all the Western ideas of democracy and government and all this kind of stuff too, but still that caste thing is there. So I think it's in some of the modern DNA studies too, they found that they can see like mixing between different geographical groups. And some of these groups in India haven't had any like genetic mixing for like 5,000 years. So it's been amazingly kind of stable. And that's why I'm saying that I think it's a different thing than our usual idea of kind of like class warfare and that. Who knows? But at the same time, I mean, with time, everything changes and falls apart. So it's rather remarkable that it's still there like it is.
It really is, because I have Indian friends, and it is definitely a part of their lives.
Yeah.
It's very important.
Yeah. So we should have Megan give a talk on it sometime, because she's, done so much with Indian and Buddhism and various things. That'd be helpful. But for me, what I'm taking from this is, again, we have we have our own kind of approaches to the Dharma, and the understanding that we have of it, or sort of where it's coming from, we don't necessarily share or know. And what's interesting about it, I mean, the liveliness of it, the fact that it is this kind of, deep essence kind of thing, shows you that, I mean, it worked in China, it worked in India, two vastly different cultures. And not only are their languages completely unrelated, but, their societies and everything, the basic assumptions. Yeah, Keen.
Doing all that. What the Buddha did, because his philosophy was caste.
Well, that's what's rather remarkable, yeah. Because in the Buddhist text, you don't see anything about caste.
Right.
So,
There's
and
a lot of the stuff about him, like giving, untouchables.
Yeah.
Making him the king's teacher.
Yeah.
That's one story that I know.
Yeah, and there's also, in modern India, again, one of the writers of the Indian Constitution was, I can't remember his first name, but Ambedkar. And he was very active in the Congress party that was Gandhi's party, and so involved in the independence movement. And he became a convert to Buddhism. And he especially focused on the untouchables in India. And he converted tens of thousands of people. You don't hear much about it I don't know why we don't, because it's kind of an inspiring story. Every once in a while, we meet someone like that, an Indian who was in that tradition, which is kind of cool. But I'm just making the point that to me, one of the greatnesses of the Dharma is that even without this kind of sort of grooming in a societal way, the Dharma still speaks to people. So we as Americans, definitely have kind of a different vibe than a tradition.
A divorced widow woman is the lowest caste.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, some brutal things there for sure. However, the estates theory did not bear the same intimate and organic connection to the world centered upon the cities as it had to the earlier heroic world, and that for several reasons. First, it did not comprehend the new variety and complexity of occupation and position. In the older texts, for example, we read nothing of merchants, but in the Buddhist and Jain texts, they are very visible, an active part of the scene. In the older texts, there are only warriors, but in the newer, there are paid soldiers and salaried officials as well. These and other specializations were dependent upon the new states and the use of money, which arrived in North India only with the cities. These new categories of persons presented the estates theory with formidable difficulties. The theory envisioned a simple agrarian and pastoral world inhabited by four kinds of people. Where did these new figures fit in? What sort of persons were they? But that was by no means the most pressing challenge offered by the new circumstances, for there was another which struck at the very heart of the estates. This is adumbrated in the Buddhist discourse, which makes two relevant points. First, It asserts that a criminal, whether a Brahmin or a servant, warrior or husbandman, would be sentenced by the king of a newly centralized state strictly according to the seriousness of his deed, not according to his estate. This was quite contrary to the old view, however, for there the punishment, envisioned as reparation or penance, was to be appropriate to the person, to the estate of the transgressor, not only to the crime. Were Brahmins and warriors to be treated like common criminals? Were the estates not to be respected? And second, the discourse points out that in the urbanizing world of the Buddha, it was quite possible for someone born of high estate, a Brahmin or a warrior, to be employed as a servant by someone of low estate, a servant or a husbandman. Such an eventuality was wholly inconceivable under the old order. Servants could only serve, Brahmins and warriors only command. So again, the point is that the Buddha's time was one of a lot of ferment. In the discourse, these observations they give us a notation for this discourse too. I don't recognize it. It's abbreviation M2, number 84. Let's see if I can find it quickly. But I don't know where it's listed here, the different sources. At any rate, one of the old Buddhist texts. In the discourse, these observations are meant to reveal the real state of the world, as opposed to the hollow pretensions of the Brahmins, the upholders of the estates theory. And it is plausible, if we compare the pre-Buddhist texts with another new literature which began to appear about the Buddha's time, the Dharma Shastra, the science of law. I refer to the earliest, the Gautama Dharma Shastra. We learn that kings were indeed taking new powers of judgment and punishment. In any case, they could depose old elites, as in the tribal republics, and raise new ones. We also read in both Buddhist sources and the law literature that new financial arrangements, credit and debt, interest, a market and land, had come into existence. This bore the possibility that a person of rank and wealth could lose everything through rapacious business practices, or that a person of low status could rise by the same means. The difficulty for the estates theory was that it had described 4 ideal types of persons, and each type had been a harmonious blend of characteristics. A warrior, for example, was a warrior by birth, a warrior by political power, and since power was power over people and land, the only source of wealth, a warrior by wealth. But now this too was evidently contradicted by facts. There were warriors by birth who had neither power nor wealth. There were wealthy men, merchants, who had neither birth nor power. And there were powerful men in the new states who were not warriors by birth. A person in any of these positions could have found his actual plight at painful variance with the one attributed to him in the estate scheme. That old version of human nature and the human world simply did not express the new reality. To this problem, there were 2 responses. The first was that of the Brahmins, the theorists of the estates. In their science of law, a series of texts which appeared over many centuries after the Buddha, they gradually amended that theory. Their strategy, as in so much of Indian thought, was to keep the old, but to build on new additions. They retained the hierarchical order of the estates simply by putting new occupations in old slots. Merchants were placed with husbandmen, while many craft specialties were put in the servant estate. Regional groups or tribes were distributed among the lower 3 estates. They also devised a theory to explain the appearance of hereditary local or occupational groups, now called castes, as the result of intermarriage between the different estates. In this enterprise, they were, in the long run, so successful that Indians today still understand the complex order of castes according to the simple estates scheme. What I find interesting here too, the side note that talking about the texts that were produced, after the Buddha, because it shows that they were writing texts. I mean, we knew this, the Vedas are way before the Buddha, but it's so fascinating to me that they didn't write down the Buddhist texts for at least 200 years, despite the fact that they could have. It is amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, that blows me away. It's something so, to me, it's so important. I literally, like, I have books that the house is burning down, grabbing pieces of
Right,
books and running
right.
out.
And also, if you have some
Confusing.
tremendous, I mean, think of the respect that they had for the Buddha and the devotion. You would naturally want to kind of write it down and be showing this to other people, but they so respected the kind of, I think that the fact that it was beyond concept that they managed to not write it down. But our interest lies with the other response. This was formed quite in opposition to the Brahmins by the ascetics and philosophical wanderers, whose rank the Buddha was to join. Their answer is found in both Buddhist and Jain sources, and it is so fundamental to the ascetic's point of view that it must have been already present, in rough form at least, when the Buddha arrived on the scene. Mentioning the Jains here too. Yeah, the founder of the Jains is Mahavira, I think, was a great ascetic, and he was older than Shakyamuni, but was alive at the same time. It's not known whether they ever met. The Buddha expressed this common view in especially clear form in dialogue with a Brahmin, and again, one of the old Pali texts, D1. I don't know which text that refers to. In the dialogue, he asked the Brahmin the leading question, what makes a true Brahmin? This, in effect, amounts to asking, what makes the best, the supreme species of humankind? For according to the estate scheme, the Brahmin is just that. In reply, the Brahmin claims that he and his fellows hold their elevated position by virtue of a number of qualities which they enjoy simultaneously. They are at once of highest birth, of greatest learning, the most beautiful, the wisest, and the most virtuous. So that would be like an A-list celebrity, right? This is perfectly orthodox. The Brahmin believes himself to be a harmonious bundle of praiseworthy qualities. But then the Buddha dissects this claim by inquiring into its details. Could one fairly claim to be a Brahmin without pure descent through 7 generations on both sides? Well, apparently so. Could one claim to be a Brahmin without mastery of Brahmanical learning? Yes. Could one claim to be a Brahmin without physical beauty? Most assuredly. Could one claim to be Brahmin status without wisdom and without virtue? No, replied the Brahmin. For these were the very grounds on which the Brahmins stood, the foundation of their claimed spiritual leadership and high rank, wisdom and virtue. One doubts that a Brahmin could really have been forced to make these damning admissions, but the very fact that an argument of this form could be made points to a substantial change in intellectual climate. For now, not only was the Brahmanical view challenged, but also those 2 qualities, wisdom and virtue, had become detached from traditional Brahmanical interpretations of them. Virtue. Now there was some general view of what might constitute good behavior, quite apart from what might be appropriate to a particular estate. For the Buddha's point is that virtue is something anyone can have. It is not ascribed by birth, but achieved by application. And likewise, wisdom is to be achieved and cannot just be ascribed. So the true Brahmin is simply the person born of whatever parentage who has both wisdom and virtue. Is that mind-boggling?
What a way to like get someone to learn something and break their argument down into pieces. That's amazing.
And it's so Socratic, isn't it? I mean, just asking questions and again, even if this interaction didn't really happen in this way, if you can imagine, kind of the weight, the inertia of a society like this, where like it's all just set, you're born and that's what it is, and everybody's agreeing with it, even.
I imagine those conversations happening every day with the Buddha.
Yeah. Well, he had a tremendous effect, and but you get a sense for it. I mean, again, suddenly, and the liberating aspect of this, because suddenly wisdom and virtue is accessible to everybody.
It was difficult for him to get to the point where he want to teach what you learned.
I think what he was up against. The argument is directed against Brahman pretensions and favors the ascetic's claims to possess wisdom and virtue. But the implication is far greater, for it implies that there is some basic human nature capable of wisdom and virtue, quite apart from one's estate or position. At a stroke, the bewildering variety of different ranks and different fates was set in the background, while in the foreground was set one simple common endowment. In principle, any human being can become wise and good. This assumption was made in one way or another by many of the Buddha's contemporaries. They spoke not merely to this or that condition, to this or that estate, but to the human condition as such. It was a revolutionary step, for until it was taken, the Indians had no way of speaking of human life beyond the narrow local conception of estates, bound to the older order of Indian society. They now had the opportunity to speak to a very much wider world, and it was an opportunity that the Buddha exploited more than any of his fellows. So we'll do it just a little bit more. We're still in chapter 2.
Frank, I'd love to.
Yeah.
Megan can talk. I mean, to unite a whole country when they're all, just warring, crazy, separate. I mean, there must have been thousands of kingdoms and
No, I think there were like a dozen kingdoms or 20 kingdoms or something, and they were small.
All right.
They,
imagine them just being every, like Wegmans. Wegmans is a new,
right,
something going on.
right,
And they're everywhere.
right. I think it wasn't until, I think it wasn't until King Ashoka is what, like 300 years after the Buddha? That's when India first started to be unified, at least the north. I mean, the southern Indians, the Tamils to this day talk of themselves as being the pure Hindus, because they were never conquered, I guess, by the northern folks.
They're the pure people who have the
I don't
British
know.
name of Hindu.
There's so much there that we don't know. All right, renouncing the world. This may seem momentous to us, but in fact it was but a small part of a much greater project which the Buddha inherited from the wanderers when he renounced the world. Their concern was not so much human society as its horizons, birth and death, and the vast spiritual cosmos which lay behind the fleeting appearances of this life. They looked upon the society of the Ganges basin as though from afar and disdained it. They were indeed homeless wanderers, spiritual strivers, renouncers of the world and all its fruits, but they were also perhaps India's only true cosmopolitans, citizens of the whole, not just of part. That cosmopolitanism is shown by the fact that the young Buddha-to-be knew enough of them in his provincial home to decide to join them. The earliest sources on his renunciation are bare and simple, but they attest well enough to the perspective of the renouncers. He was just, quote, a youth with coal-black hair in the early stages of life, unquote. That's again from one of the early Buddhist sutras. He was a youth with coal-black hair in the early stages of life when he left the world. This casts doubts on the existence of the wife and child later traditions awarded him, but it does illustrate that to leave the world was a whole life's vocation. There was also a specific motive for renunciation. Quote, it occurred to me that life in the home is cramped and dirty, while the life gone forth into homelessness is wide open. It is difficult to live a spiritual life completely perfect and pure in all its parts while cabined inside, unquote. Again, from one of the early Pali Sutras. From this, we can infer some of the adventurous high-mindedness associated with the wanderer's life in the Buddha's time. They sought an ideal of perfection elevated beyond the squalid exigencies and mean quarrels of ordinary experience. They were bent not on their own pleasure, but on a lofty enterprise, which sometimes brought them honor, but also struggle and difficulty. To be a renouncer's was a young man's, indeed a romantic's, aspiration. And from this point of view, the Buddha was but one of many youths who left home attracted by the challenge of the wandering life. But the counterpart to this enthusiasm was a somber and deeply serious view of such a life's task. For the refined ideals of virtue and wisdom laid upon these wanderers a burden of perfection which perhaps few could achieve in detail. And second, they left ordinary life not just because of its irritations, but because of its dangers. In the bare account of his reflections before renunciation, the Buddha's first great change of heart is described thus. So this is a quote. Why, since I am myself subject to birth, aging, disease, death, sorrow, and defilement, do I seek after what is also subject to these things? Suppose, being myself subject to these things, seeing danger in them, I were to seek the unborn, the unaging, the undiseased, the deathless, the sorrowless, the undefiled supreme surcease of bondage, the extinction of all these troubles, unquote. This account is filtered through the Buddha's later thought, but what we can see through the filter is the starkness of the alternatives. The unexamined and uncontrolled life of the home leads only to sorrow and despair, endlessly repeated. Only the renouncer's life offers hope, the hope of looking down upon a morass of desire and suffering from an eminence of knowledge and dispassion. Western writers have often counted this view as unrelieved pessimism, but they have missed the optimism, the prospect of attaining the deathless. The renouncer's attitude was compounded of dark bitterness and bright hope. Let's see if we have any place here. Maybe. What rendered this attitude compelling was a larger theory which lay behind it, explaining and justifying the renouncer's rejection of the world. In this view, the ordinary activity of the householder was contrasted with the extraordinary inactivity of the renouncer. For the householder must commit acts or deeds, Sanskrit karman, in pursuit of his worldly ends, such as sexual pleasure, procreation, the acquisition of goods, and power over others. Such deeds do not include inconsequential ones, say as brushing your teeth, but only those which are consequential or fruitful, which substantially affect your own or someone else's condition. Moreover, these deeds have spiritual consequences beyond the purely visible ones, for they are charged with the power to create another body and life for the hapless householder, causing him to be reborn. If this seems peculiar, it should be remembered that it is no less rational than the belief that our deeds consign us to heaven or hell, or that they call down on us supernatural retribution. And in being reborn, he is considered to suffer and desire in another life, just as he does in this one. Suffering of one life, therefore, is but a sample of the endless suffering one will inevitably experience as one dies and is reborn again and again on the running on and on samsara of life in the world of desire and sorrow. In contrast, the renouncer lives in celibacy, poverty, harmlessness, and desirelessness, which amount not so much to good activity as to inactivity, for he simply does not commit acts which are charged with the awful power to cause him to be reborn. Thereby, the successful renouncer escapes the cycle of rebirth completely. True, the householder may achieve a better rebirth in heaven or as a Brahmin by good deeds, or a worse one in hell or as an animal by bad deeds. The householder can control his fate to that extent, but this is as nothing beside the fact that in whatever birth, even the most exalted, suffering, death, and rebirth are inevitable. Only by renouncing the world entirely, by giving up all flawed activity, can one escape from this awesome mechanism into the unborn, the unaging, the undiseased, and the deathless. The law of causation is impersonal, not administered by a god, and universal, for it applies to all sentient beings, animal, human, or supernatural, who are reborn in accordance with their acts. Certainly it must have been the development of this view, and not just a criticism of the estate theory, which led the renouncers to discover human nature. For the Buddhist discourse, which remarks that anyone can become a servant, or that anyone is punished by a king according to his deeds, also appeals to this universal law of causation. Everyone, the discourse says, whether Brahmin or servant, must experience the consequences of his deeds in another life. But anyone, Brahmin or servant, may become a renouncer to escape rebirth entirely. These are the fundamental refutations of the estate theory. Social criticism was incidental. What the renouncers saw was the plight of all sentient beings, among whom the human condition was but a special case. As a novice, the Buddha must have found this clearer in outline than in its details. But in any case, both the theory of moral causation and the project of escaping it were already established, though on the scale of centuries it was relatively new. In the older pre-Buddhist texts, there are only a few hints of it. In later pre-Buddhist texts, the Upanishads, it had taken shape. And by the Buddha's time, reincarnation was commonly accepted, and the renouncers had become, in effect, a fifth estate, a notably important part of the life of societies. There are many unanswered and unanswerable questions about how the renouncers and their worldview developed, but in any case, their practices and their theory must have developed together. Only a body of men whose practices were moving away from ordinary life could have come to adopt such a distant and somber view. And only such a grand, general, and all-embracing theory could have justified such a hard life or inspired people throughout the Ganges basin to respect and support the renouncers as mendicants. The renouncers were made by their world, but they also made it as teachers, preachers, and exemplars. Their theory of reincarnation has frequently been treated as an irrational religious view, perhaps even a very old one, which was already present when the warrior societies conquered North India. There may be some truth in this, but it ignores the power of the theory to explain a complex world, as it ignores the theory's relative sophistication. Whether one was favorably endowed by birth or not, whether one was rising in the king's court or had lost one's ancestral lands, whether one were successful in business or were defeated by the king's armies, the theory could explain it. Success, beauty, and power in this world are the result of good acts in previous life. The humble goodness of the poor now will garner its just reward in the next life, while prosperous wrongdoing will be punished. Moreover, not only events within life, but its ultimate ends, birth, old age, and death, were set within a much larger scheme within which they could be remedied. It is not at all surprising that the theory was accepted so widely in one form or another throughout Indian civilization and even by Brahmins, in its use of abstract moral categories of good and evil to apply to all acts, in its positing of a natural law of cause and effect, and in its impersonality. It was the product of generations or centuries of intellectual effort. It would continue to be refined and developed by the Buddha and his contemporaries. So that's page 24. We'll stop there. It's a little difficult, sitting listening to all this prose or reading. But I think it's, at least speaking for myself, it was helpful because, again, in our way of having some understanding, and this is, so much what Megan's work and Tracy's too, history, it gives us a story, it gives us some context, it gives a greater appreciation, but also for the differences, the vast differences in cultures and civilizations. And to me, what strikes me is that somehow the Buddha Dharma is like working on all 7 continents. Is Antarctica the 8th continent or is that the 7th? I never know. Yeah.
Flowers, so it's something now.
There we go. But also this has the advantage of us, setting forth a kind of a non-controversial academic view of the Buddha's career, which again I think is very helpful in talking to people. You're talking to people on the level at which they're at. You can't, with Americans, you can't really start out by talking about Achi Chokidroma, riding her magical horse with her turquoise stirrups. Yeah, right. Well, it is, but it's the meaning, and there are special people for whom that kind of vibrates. But your ordinary person in the street, the people at the coffee pot, is you don't want to say too much. You want to say enough that causes maybe a opening in their heart, kind of a curiosity, or at least leaving an impression that some sensibility there.
Like your job interviewer said to you.
Right.
No, my wife, she was a witchcraft.
That's right. Keen's repeating one of my cranky stories. But no, it's good. It's good. I am so impressed by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, floating around the world like that, talking with reporters, government officials, all the thing you do. It's so easy to get tripped up in this world of ours. It's just remarkable what he's done. There's some people who are definitely not Buddhists, or especially sometimes people who are very a-religious or sort of extreme Marxist types, who aren't happy with him. But, I don't know. I've just never seen, there's not a big body of people out there who are disdainful of the Dalai Lama. And when you read his writings on the higher teachings, you just go, my goodness, unbelievable the wisdom that's there. And then the practicality of it is actually being, leader of a people, although officially he's not anymore. Pretty amazing. So, all right. First, any thoughts, questions, reactions, anything from anybody?
Can I ask you a question about the last book?
Yeah. No, you're fine. Pass over the mic, the mobile mic.
Well, I've been still trying to wrap my head around the profound Buddhism.
Yeah.
The Rinpoche. There's just.
Is it on? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was been trying to wrap my head around all that. It's just so much in that book, and so the whole, from what I understand, the concept of Mahamudra is to just meditate directly on the reflection of the mind itself and not have an object,
Right.
that you meditate on. Normally, when I meditate, I focus on my breath a lot,
Right.
and so this has just been real. I've been like every day trying to sit down and do this Mahamudra meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find it really difficult. And I'm wondering if there's any insights or any exercises or anything that could help with that style of meditation.
It's an excellent question. It's just an excellent question, because it's really true. How do you do an objectless meditation? It's so vast.
It leaves the door open for all your thoughts.
Right.
And stuff,
Right.
So.
Right. And that's why it's the highest meditation. It's the simplest, but it's the most difficult. And the text I'd recommend is Gaur Rinpoche taught here on the Ganges Mahamudra. I'll find a little text of it for you. Talopa,
You might have a copy.
Talopa's, and Gaur Rinpoche gives a little book of it, like the 37 practices. So it's Talopa's instructions to Naropa on the banks of the Ganges. And it's the classic Mahamudra text. A similar one, although it's not Mahamudra, it's Dzogchen, but same kind of challenge, is the flight of the Garuda. So back there in the corner, from Hiroka, our friend, passed away, and she left this Garuda for us. You see this sometimes with the wings. Gaur Rinpoche. Yeah, it's this creature. You see them actually in Bali too, from the time that it was Buddhist. It's also in Hinduism, but the Buddhist symbolism is, with one flap of the wings, the Garuda goes from the lowest hell to the highest heaven. So it's direct understanding. But truly, the Tantra is like aids to Mahamudra. And what I mean by that is that these 9 different levels of Tantra are increasing levels of subtlety. And so to give you an example, even when we do our our practices here, where there's the creation phase and then the dissolution stage of each meditation, of each visualization. So even in the creation, because we know we're dealing with just the mind itself, it's more skillful. Even doing something like breath is good, because breath is autonomous. Even when you're unconscious, you're still breathing. You don't have to think to breathe. So it's a more powerful meditation than meditating on a concept like patience or something. Although that's good too. You want increasing subtlety. So we're using ourselves as a Buddha body made out of light, and that's already harder than the breath, obviously. Then when we dissolve, we're actually in Mahamudra. That is the state. Because we have this subtle attachment to subtle forms, which is helpful because, our habit is grabbing onto something. And so instead of grabbing onto gold, we're going to visualize gold. There's something that's more refined about that and leading us towards Mahamudra. And so similarly, when you dissolve the visualization, you've been sort of playing in this realm of the Buddhas, the Pure Lands, and then suddenly even the form is gone. Now with Mahamudra, it's neither form nor non-form. Everything that's arising in the mind is recognized immediately. So there's absolutely no attachment. It's said to be like, you see these snakes that are all tangled up in themselves, and yet they can completely undo their tangle. It looks miraculous. Have you ever seen videos of that? A ball of snakes, and then suddenly they all go away. They seem to be tied up, but they weren't really. And that's Mahamudra. But that text, I think, will be helpful.
What's the title of that text?
Yeah, the Ganges Mahamudra.
Ganges.
Yeah, because
I'll remind you.
yeah, do, because he gave it on the banks of the Ganges, and Garam Rinpoche taught him that here, and it was, wonderful. But truly, that's your understanding, kind of the need or the compassion of the Tantra, because step by step by step, more and more subtle. The other example that's been given, in saying a little bit about that, for instance, like in the lower tantras, for instance, I always confuse the Charya and the Upa Tantra. I think it's Upa Tantra is the first one. We don't visualize ourselves as a Buddha. The Buddha's out in front, but we have to do all these incredible practices, like changing your clothes 4 times a day. You can only drink out of a copper vessel, all these outer purity kind of ideas. So it's establishing this idea of purity, not only in our mind as a concept, but we're actually doing it. And then the next level up, there's less reliance on that. And as you go up and up and up, it becomes less reliant on the actual form or the actual thing. And it's always vaster until, again, the 9th Tantra is Ati Yoga, Dzogchen, but for us, Mahamudra. Some subtle differences there, but no difference in realization. Yeah. The other thing that I came to understand, and this was, I learned some things through reading Chogyam Trungpa, because he very much liked Suzuki Roshi from the San Francisco Zen Center. And he very much admired him, and they had a kind of a neat working relationship together. And I think this is from Trungpa, but it was certainly something I came to understand, that, the practice in say Zen is this, at least with the Rinzai Zen, with the koans in that, is this incredible kind of concentration. It's like, it's the perfection of wisdom. You're dropping all your distractions. You're putting your energy into a one-pointed meditation. And the idea is that there's a breakthrough. But with that breakthrough, the practice is Mahamudra, where everything is, instead of this intense kind of seemingly artificial concentrating the mind, they say like a lens concentrating the rays of the sun, which are all over the place, into something that can start a fire. But once that breakthrough is there, Mahamudra is a complete relaxation. And suddenly the whole world becomes, let's say, like a bowl of rice. You can stick your head in and eat anytime you want. So it's so different in attitude, because there's the practice, but then there's the realization. And this is expressed also in the teachings that Kempo gives on the different, bodhisattva levels, for instance. It's so helpful for us to have sort of a taste of that, because it informs the whole thing of practice. And then you realize, that's what Jidgen Sumgen says, that there's not like higher practices and lower practices. They're all Buddha mind. They're all from the Buddha. And someone who's practicing, strictly according to the conventional sutra, perfect. But I'll find that. Yeah.
I wondered if one of our friends would like a book about Buddhism. She likes the idea of the benefiting everyone when you practice. She doesn't really necessarily want to become a Buddhist.
Mm-hmm.
I have her one book already, but could you suggest maybe one or two books that?
It is tricky with books because, what's perfect for you at one time isn't necessarily at another. And this little book, why don't you see how you feel about this book as we get a little more into it? Because one thing I've liked about it is that it is so inoffensive. It's not a religious text, so it's not, it doesn't require a certain kind of understanding or experiential or confidence, faith even. And so it's helpful because it's, more historical kind of, like he's talking about here, the framework, what was going on in India at the Buddha's time. Let me think about that a little bit, Roberta, too, because I've been kind of going over our books, which are all scattered over everywhere, and remembering some of the things that, I read at a certain time that seemed so appropriate. So just give me a week to think about that a little bit, if you would.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm sorry, you made me, before Keen starts, you made me chuckle, Roberta, because I just happened to pick up yesterday. This is what I was thinking about, and I brought it with me. I don't know why tonight. This is Lama Gape's, who's one of Garamche's chant master and is head of the center at Los Angeles, and he's been here several times too. And he wrote a book, The Protection and Repelling Practice, the Repelling Drupchen of Manjushri Yamantaka. And I was reading it just to clarify a certain part of the visualization. And, I saw the increasing detail of the visualization that I do. There's even more. You can get into it deeper and deeper and deeper, even in that explanatory way. But it just made me kind of laugh, because this is not the book that you want to give to someone who's interested in the qualities of the Buddhists and what they've accomplished, and the love and compassion. It truly is mind-boggling. But who doesn't necessarily want to be Buddhist, or isn't even considering that, or for whom that would be kind of a little bit of an obstacle, trying to avoid that. Yeah, Keen.
I was just going to say that I think that book does kind of do it in a way that is not as, how can I say, spiritual as maybe others, have written other books that we've read, actually.
Right.
But his comments on causation, the way that he described that, that's the same way that Kempo was describing, the Four Noble Truths, right?
And action. Karma is action.
Right. Karma is action. Or the way he says causation, then it made me think the opposite is the cessation, right? Because once you realize the causation, then you know how to, and then how he was talking about in explaining the renunciates, and that was, I think that was a good description in a way that didn't really seem very religious, actually.
Right. He's coming from an academic point of view, but a knowledgeable point of view.
Yes.
And again, always, that's Buddhism 101. It's about the meaning, the understanding. It's not about the appearance per se. They're all just tools, or the concepts or the paintings or whatever. It's so remarkable. It's the greatest educational system the world has ever devised, in my humble opinion.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Well, and then I was thinking this book is kind of different because we read another book on the Buddha. Remember the black one that talked about it was the history of the Buddha, but it was a while back. But
Yeah. can't remember.
I know, I can't remember the name of it, but that one was kind of different because I don't know if he's going to go to these places, but he went into like all the kings who he became friends with and were supporters of the Buddha.
Yeah, I think some of that'll be in here
Living
too,
later. Oh,
from what they know. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Anybody else? All right. Then let's just do a short dedication and wonderful night. We offer the merit from this evening, this stream of good intention, the great aspiration of bodhicitta. We offer this to all motherly sentient beings. May we never cease until our understanding is complete and every single one is free. Svaha. Okay. Yeah, thank you all. It's